Well, welcome again, everybody, to Make Your Veggie Garden Beautiful. And I'm Jenny Kramer, Horticulture Program Manager, and I'm going to introduce you all to Teresa Craighead. Teresa is one of our intrepid Master Gardener volunteers. She's actually relatively new. I think, Teresa, you trained in 2016, but she has been unabashed about getting up and teaching classes and being super brave. And I love that about you, Teresa. Teresa's really found that teaching is one of the ways that she's expanded her knowledge as a master gardener. She takes a subject she wants to know more about. She's a fantastic researcher. She also gets a lot of knowledge from working as a docent at the Cornell Botanic Gardens. And she's put together an absolutely lovely slideshow for you today. And we're just so grateful to have you doing this with us, Teresa. Welcome.
Thank you, Jenny. All right, so I believe we're going to begin, unless you would like to do the polls before I begin the slides.
Let's go ahead and do the polls. The polls are a way for us to learn a little bit more about all of you. So you should now be able to see the question, where do you garden? It's a multiple choice because some of you might have a home that's in a rural area or in an urban area, or you might have a community garden. So you can choose as many of those as describe you. And then the second question in this poll, you'll have to scroll down to get all of those options, is where in the world is your garden? We're going to give everybody about 1 minute to do all the answering. So far, about 66 of you have figured out how to answer the poll. We've got 100 of you here in the classroom. And there we go. It's been a minute. So I'm going to go ahead and end this and we can check out our answers. So it looks like 91% of you garden at home and 17% of you garden in a community garden. And about a third of you are in rural areas and the rest of you are divided up into urban, suburban, or something else. And it looks like our biggest crowd is from here in New York State, but outside of Tompkins County. And then we have almost the same number of people that are in the city or town of Ithaca. And then about 20 of you or so are in Tompkins County, but outside of the city of Ithaca. And then about 8 of you are from outside of New York State. So welcome all of you. And you can see that right there. All right, so now that we have a sense of who you are, let's we're going to launch one more poll. And let's see. Let's go to question number 2. And this is to get a sense of where you are on the edible to ornamental spectrum. And I love that in 40 seconds, we have a 73% voter turnout. Thank you very much. So let's get the last couple of you in here. And I'm going to end the poll in just a few seconds. And it looks like most of you do about half and half. About half of you altogether do mostly one and a little bit of the other. A few of you are really only all about edibles, and nobody responded ornamental gardening all the way. So all of you seem to have at least some, if not a lot, of edible gardening experience. So this is going to be a great class because this is the most inspirational set of pictures out here. So we're going to go ahead and get started, and I'll hand this over to Teresa.
All right, thank you very much, Mila. I'm going to see if I'm still showing the poll on my screen. Is there a way for you to take that down?
Did that go away now?
No.
Oh, it went away on mine. Here, let's try that. Did that go away?
No, it did not.
Is there a little X in the top button that you can close on the top of the polls?
Yeah, but I can't access it.
Oh, okay, because I've hit the close button and it disappeared on mine. Jenny, you're muted. Let's unmute you. Okay. Hi there.
You may have to, sorry about that. You may have to stop sharing your screen to unmute the poll, to close the poll. I'm not sure if that's why you're having difficulty doing it, but my guess is you may have to do that for just a minute.
The problem is, let me see.
Hang tight, everyone. Technology, so much fun.
There should be a close button at the bottom of those of you who are just viewing it.
And then when I hovered, I had a little red X in the top left also that I had the option to close.
Okay, so it looks here from the people who have responded in chat, they can all, it's gone from their views.
But still on Teresa's. That's why I was thinking the screen sharing might be the issue.
All right, I've managed to get rid of that.
Absolutely fantastic.
Seem to be having mouse issues. Unable to advance my slides.
Oh, just click on your screen and it should work. So not using the keys, but using your mouse button and clicking anywhere on your slides.
Here we go. All right, everybody. I'm so sorry about the technical issues, but I think we are ready to go. I want to thank Jenny and Mila for their introductory words, and also thank them for doing so much coaching and cheerleading in the background. I certainly would not be able to provide this class to you tonight without all the help that they have provided. So my name is Teresa Craighead, and as Jenny said, I think I'm going into my 4th year as a master gardener. And I will tell you that if I had been filling out that poll that we did a few minutes ago, I would have had to say I mostly come at this topic from the point of view of an ornamental gardener. However, as I have become, I also have a small vegetable garden. And as I've gotten my feet on the ground with vegetable gardening, I've become more and more interested in how I can integrate my vegetable garden into my home landscape and make it as pretty as the ornamentals that are around me. So that's what I've been researching, and that's what I'm going to be sharing with you this evening. So just very quickly, the topics that we're going to be going over this evening, or the pointers in a nutshell, are here on this slide. You do not need to write them down because after the class in the next couple of days, you'll be receiving a handout which includes all of these pointers, as well as a plant list of the plants that we'll be talking about this evening. So the pointers in a nutshell, we'll be talking about growing flowers in and around your vegetable garden, choosing vegetables with ornamental qualities, creating edges around your beds, laying out your garden and using interesting shapes for your garden beds, planting in patterns, creating boundaries and borders around your garden. We will pick up some pointers from potager gardens. We'll talk about functional and artistic structures, which are so necessary for some of the vegetables we grow. We'll talk about including accessories in your garden and keeping it looking pretty. And then at the very end of this presentation, we'll also be talking about vegetables that you can add to your ornamental beds. So they don't have to be confined. Vegetables don't have to be confined to your vegetable garden, and flowers don't have to be confined to your ornamental beds. So let's get started. Our first topic is for beautifying our vegetable gardens is growing flowers in and around our vegetable gardens. I love this quote from a gardener by the name of Rosalind Creasy. She says, "I've checked the Constitution and planting flowers in a vegetable garden is not forbidden. Not only can you put flowers with vegetables, you should." Well, why should you? Of course, we're all here this evening because we want to add beauty and ornamental qualities to our vegetable gardens. But you should also add flowers because they're so important to attracting pollinators and attracting beneficial insects that might eat pests for you that are invading your garden. Some flowers will serve as living mulch, some will loosen and improve the soil, and some will even serve as a cover crop for you. So in addition to the beauty they bring us, they provide all these bonuses as well. And I know this is not a pollination class, but we should spend just a moment on it because it's so important. The more pollinator plants or flowers that you have near your vegetable garden, the greater the chance that you will have for a successful garden. Pollination needs to be repeated by multiple visits from insects to ensure complete pollination. If there aren't enough visits, you may see fruit that is malformed or maybe not form at all. And the zucchinis in this picture are definitely malformed, and that's probably because there is incomplete pollination. So plant flowers very freely around and in your garden in order to improve production. Now, I did a little reading on this topic in the Missouri Botanical Garden website, which is a trusted resource for many gardeners. And there was a little blurb there about cucurbits, which are your melons and squash and cucumbers, and they actually need 15 bee visits in order to achieve complete pollination. I was pretty impressed with that number. So put up a sign for the bees and all the pollinator insects, plant flowers. That's the sign that says, "Come hither," to those pollinators. And then when that magic moment happens, when the male and female squash flowers open, they will already be in the vicinity and ready to do those repeated visits. So which flowers should we choose? There are things to think about. You need to think about the size of the beds in your garden and the size of your entire vegetable garden. Think about the height of your crops and the height of your flowers. If you have a small vegetable garden, maybe you can't accommodate a lot of flowers in it, but maybe you can put some around it. Maybe if your crops are small, on the small side, you don't want flowers that are going to shade them a lot. And you may want to think about your crop selection and if you're interested in companion planting, because you might need to find flowers that are of benefit to the vegetables that you plan to grow. We would also urge you to think about growing annuals, especially if you are going to be growing flowers inside your vegetable garden, right with your vegetables. And that's because most of us who are vegetable gardeners know that from one season to the next, you need to rotate your crops in order not to deplete the soil and in order to avoid building up pathogens. And if you're growing annual flowers, they are in there for this season, and then they die and they won't come back. And when you rotate next year, you'll be able to rotate your vegetables as well as where you put your flowers. Also, since we're focusing on how to make our vegetable gardens beautiful, it's important that annual flowers will often offer a continuous bloom all summer. Whereas if you put in perennials, not only would you have the rotation problem, but they often will bloom for a couple of weeks and then they're done. So what are some of the frequently recommended annuals for beautifying your garden? Well, here are some that come up over and over again. Calendula, chamomile, cosmos, nasturtiums, sweet alyssum, marigolds, sunflowers, and zinnias. So you may know calendulas as pot marigolds. They have this very pretty yellow-orange color. You can see in the picture on the left that this gardener planted them in with, right in her garden with a lot of, looks like cabbages and some other things in the background, and this is very pretty. Some bonuses if you elect to use calendula is that number one, it's often an ingredient in herbal remedies, particularly in ointment used for burns and wounds. So if you are into making herbal remedies, you can do that with calendula. And calendula is also a trap plant, meaning that it will attract aphids and thrips and other insects, and the insects will go to your calendula. The insects will be trapped by the calendula and stay away from the vegetables that you presumably want to harvest and eat. So this is a very valuable plant for your vegetable garden. And then there's chamomile, which many of us are familiar with because it's often used for tea. It's also an insect magnet. It will attract pollinators and beneficials, including bees. You can see in the picture on the left that it has a very fine, feathery appearance. And in this garden, it's planted next to Swiss chard, it looks like, which has a much chunkier, broader leaf. So there's a very nice juxtaposition of textures going on there, which is another way of beautifying your garden, going for a variety of textures. Cosmos is probably an annual you are all familiar with. It is also helpful in attracting insects, in addition to giving that kind of windblown, ethereal impression. The white and orange varieties attract green lacewings, and then their larvae eat aphids, scale, and thrips. So again, beauty plus function. And then nasturtiums, probably many of you are aware that the blossoms are edible, so that's a bonus. Also, they have this beautiful trailing habit. The picture on the left shows the nasturtiums growing in a raised bed underneath what looks like might be a teepee with being used for tomatoes. And so the nasturtiums are spilling over the edge of the raised bed, which looks very pleasing. Also, because they spread out, they tend to have a smothering effect, and so that will suppress weeds. And of course, anything that spreads out is also going to help retain moisture. Sweet alyssum is another one of our recommended annuals. It's a small, very compact flower. And so if you need something that's really small, this would be a great one to choose. Its bonus is that it smells great, and so it provides a natural perfume in the garden. In the picture on the left, you can see that this gardener chose to plant her lettuce in kind of a diamond pattern and then put sweet alyssum on the inside of each diamond. And then on top of that, you can see the gardener chose to use both white and purple sweet alyssum. So very pretty indeed. You may be a sunflower fan, and I think most of us are. They're so cheerful and beautiful and welcome to look at. We do have a little bit of a caution when it comes to sunflowers. They may have a little bit of a allelopathic characteristic, which simply means that their root systems may exude a chemical that will interfere with the growth of nearby plants. Some of you may experience this with things like black walnut. Sunflowers don't appear to be nearly that problematic, but what you may want to do if you choose to grow these right next to vegetables is to give those vegetables a head start. Make sure the seedlings have been growing for a bit and are well established before you plant your sunflowers. The other thing to be aware of with sunflowers is that some are strictly ornamental and some are used for producing seed. So depending on what you are trying to do with your sunflowers, making sure you choose the variety that performs the way you want. Zinnias are very common annual, but also very appropriate for the vegetable garden. Be aware that they come in many varieties and sizes. So if you just grab a pack of zinnias off the rack at the home store or wherever you buy your seeds, you may end up with zinnias that are 24 inches tall and flowers several inches across, when what you were really hoping for was something very compact and maybe a little mound. So read your seed packets or read the information in your seed catalog, and again, get the right size for your situation. Marigolds are considered a very valuable flower for the garden. Believe it or not, there are about 50 species, and because there are so many different varieties of marigolds, sometimes it's important to find them or ask for them by the scientific name, which is pronounced tagetes. Why are they so valuable? Well, they are widely regarded as a pest deterrent. They're easy to grow. There are many varieties, and you can do things like pairing them with onions, which works great because they both repel damaging insects. I did this last season before I ever even realized it was a thing. I don't know if I can credit the onions and marigolds together, but I did not have very many insects in my vegetable garden. So there are three types of marigolds. There's the French marigold, Tagetes patula. This is the one you will commonly find in local nurseries. It's about 6 to 12 inches tall, 6 to 9 inches wide, and you'll get double flower heads like the ones shown in that picture. That variety is called Superhero Spry. Now, I keep mentioning all the different varieties of marigolds. I was able to find a dwarf version of French marigolds last year, and that's what I grew near my garden since I cannot accommodate large flowers. The next kind of marigold is called Tagetes tenuifolia, also called a signet marigold. These are a little bit taller. The flowers are just single, whereas the patula has a double flower, and they're about 1 inch across. These are edible, so you can pull them apart and use them in salads and vegetables. Also, another thing about signet marigolds is that they have a different scent. from marigolds you may be familiar with. Ellen Ogden, who wrote a wonderful book I'll be showing you later about kitchen gardening, says they have a lemony scent. So if you don't like the scent of marigolds, this might be one that you can tolerate. And then finally, there's Tagetes erecta, or the African marigold. It's much bigger. It can be up to 4 feet tall. It can have a spread of 2 feet, and it can have huge flowers up to 5 inches across. The one in the picture is Tagetes erecta, First Lady. So you can see that you need to select your marigolds carefully for the space that you have available. In this slide, I just want to drive home the idea that all of these annuals come in many varieties, and that you need to think once again about the size of your beds, the size of your garden, and select plants and varieties that are most probably you're going to want ones that are not going to shade your sun-loving vegetables. So if you need to keep things small and low, go for nasturtiums, sweet alyssum, and the smaller varieties of marigolds and zinnias. If you can accommodate a mid-sized flowers, chamomile, calendula, some of the bigger marigolds and zinnias. And then finally, if you can take some height, go for your cosmos and your sunflowers. There are additional annual recommendations that come up from time to time. California poppies, which are very pretty, daisies, the poached egg plant, which is all the way over on the right. It's very cute with, and you can readily see why it's called a poached egg plant. It does spread quite a bit, so it's good to be aware of that. There's a plant called Phacelia, which is an annual that is sort of a lavender or purple color. It's sort of a medium-sized annual. And in addition to the lavender petals, its stamens really stick out and give it a kind of a spiky appearance. So it's sort of an interesting one. I've read that it pairs well with calendula, if you like that sort of purple and orange look together. And then finally on this slide, we have a picture of borage, which is an herb that gets kind of bushy as it grows. There are some annuals that are also useful as cover crops. So crimson clover on the left in this slide is especially pretty, as you can see from the photographs, and attracts pollinators. So you can definitely consider planting this for its ornamental qualities and then leaving it in to serve as a nitrogen fixing cover crop. I was out riding my bike on the country roads on the east side of Cayuga Lake last summer, and I came across a field of crimson clover, which was just absolutely stunning. I had to drop my bike and run over there and look at it. It was so pretty. So I think it would be a beautiful one to include in your gardens. Buckwheat, the picture on the right, will creates a kind of a canopy as it grows, and so it effectively will smother weeds that are growing underneath that canopy, and it also attracts pollinators and beneficials. But there's a little bit of a caveat that comes with buckwheat. It will seed prolifically if you let it. So when it's about 60% in bloom, according to Mila, you really need to take the plant out or at least cut the flowers off. Otherwise, you're going to have quite a buckwheat crop to deal with. So I'm going to pause here and ask Camila if we have any questions that have come in on chat.
We've had a couple of questions coming in about when to grow these. So can you put these in the ground as seeds, or can you sort them as transplants? And what we wrote in the chat is that for most of these, you can direct seed them, and transplanting them will give you a bit of a head start with getting flowers. Jenny has a great trick with her zinnias where she always starts transplants by growing them indoors and then plants them outdoors after May 15th, when it passed our last frost date. But then she also starts to direct seed them at that point so that she gets this constant flow of flowers. And that's a great idea to always have something going like that. Of all the ones that you've listed, the only one that's a little bit finicky is alyssum, and alyssum seeds are really tiny, like super, super tiny. So sometimes it's a little easier to start those as transplants than to put them out in your garden. But other than that, they're all pretty safe to go ahead and direct seed. They all do like warmer weather. Of those that you listed, calendula doesn't mind it a little bit colder. In fact, I've got calendula that self-seeded last year for my garden that's already starting to grow right now. But all the others really do need to have a wait until May 15th or so. We've had some questions about deer resistance as well. And one of the things about most of these things, deer don't really like things with a strong odor. So things like your marigolds and your calendulas and that kind of thing will do really well. Your borage will do really well. The deer won't want to go near those. I don't remember about alyssum. I've grown alyssum in my deer-filled garden, and they never seem to bother that. They don't bother the chamomile either. I'll occasionally have a deer nibble on sunflower shoots when they're first coming up, but once the sunflowers get a little bit bigger, they kind of have like a very kind of hairy set of leaves and stems, and I think that deters them. But when they're tender shoots, the deer do like them. Let's see. Okay, oh, here's a great question that I think Jenny is best served to answer because it's about cover cropping and buckwheat.
My favorite topic.
If you plant buckwheat over bishop's weed, can it overtake the weed?
I'm gonna go with no because of bishop's weed. You know, I think bishop's weed is just so persistent, and I think you're gonna have to do a little either sheet mulching or really deep digging in order to get rid of bishop's weed. And so what I might do is sort of tackle my bishop's weed in some ways, even with if you sheet mulch, for example, over bishop's weed, you still are probably gonna have bishop's weed start coming back up through that treatment that you've done. But that might be a point when a cover crop, if you were to sheet mulch, you know, dig it out, sheet mulch, and then add a cover crop, then you might start to see your cover crop suppress the bishop's weed. One thing I would do there is we do have a couple of cover crops that are allelopathic, like just like Teresa was explaining before, where their roots inhibit the growth of other plants. So winter rye is an example of that. So I might even choose a cover crop specifically that was allelopathic if I was trying to deter something like bishop's weed. And then I saw that there's also a question about if there are any combinations of veggies and flowers that one should avoid. There probably in companion planting circles are some things that might in theory be contraindicated, but I would argue that almost always that the benefit of most flowers is going to outweigh any deterrent that you have. And to make observations in your own garden, there probably are a couple things in the mint family that can get really aggressive and you wouldn't want them around your vegetables. But from a biochemistry perspective, there's nothing that I specifically avoid in my garden. Do you have anything like that, Mila, that you avoid?
Not really. I'm pretty much encouraged all.
Yeah, exactly.
So we do have a couple questions about any flower like shady areas. And I think that's a really kind of a tricky question because we're talking here in this class about adding flowers to your veggie gardens. And so one of the assumptions is that your veggie garden is going to be mostly in a full sun area. There are very few vegetables that will do well in a shady area. So if you want to talk about flowers in shady areas, that's kind of more of an ornamental thing, and we'll talk about that in a shade gardening class. But in this class, we're really, we're going to make the assumption that most people are gardening in a place where they can grow their vegetables, which means, you know, at the minimum, you're getting like 4 to 6 hours for things like your lettuces, and they're the ones that need the least amount of sun. But really, you're looking at like, you know, 6 and 8 hours of full sun in your gardens. We do have a couple of questions about, you know, if you have a slightly more wet spot. The only one of these flowers that I would not recommend if you've got a consistently damp area of your garden is the alyssum. The alyssum really likes being kind of in this middle place. If it's too dry, it won't do well. If it's too wet, it just kind of gets limp and doesn't really flower very well. But all the other ones are pretty hardy and can handle pretty much all your conditions. And then we've got more cover crop questions, but I think we've got, we should probably move on because Jenny does teach a class on cover crops where she gets into all the detail, because cover crops are one of those things that like makes her eyes light up.
All right, so we will move on to our next topic, or our next pointer for making your vegetable garden pretty. And thank you for all those questions, those were great. So the next thing you can consider is choosing vegetable varieties with ornamental qualities. So vegetable plants, definitely, some of them can rival ornamental plants for their beauty. And let's talk about what some of those are and what qualities you should consider when you're selecting your vegetables for their beauty. First of all, you might want to consider color. There are very definitely colorful vegetables out there, colorful lettuces, for example. And in this slide, we're featuring new red fire lettuce, as well as a cabbage called Ruby Perfection. That really pretty dusty red color, but also looks very floral the way it grows. I want to point out that both of these vegetables are included in the vegetable varieties for gardeners in New York State, which means that these have been grown by some of your colleagues in the area. They've been grown successfully here. New red fire lettuce, I would also point out, is described by Johnny's Seeds as one that you can plant later in the summer, August, for example, for fall harvest. So not only does it give you color, but if you're looking for a lettuce that you can plant as a succession lettuce and then harvest later in the season, this would be one that you could use. You also want to consider the flowers that vegetables might bring into your garden. Pole beans are always very attractive, particularly the scarlet runner beans, which has that beautiful kind of reddish orange color, bringing floral interest to the garden. And then snap peas and snow peas. You can always see their flowers really well as they're climbing up the trellis. And they're always a very welcome sight. In this particular picture, we're showing Cascadia sugar snap peas. Again, both of these varieties are on the list of vegetables for New York State gardeners. So you should be able to successfully grow these. If you're from out of state, and I think I remember there are a few people we have from out of state, you might want to check and see if the Cooperative Extension for your state publishes a similar list. When you're selecting vegetables for beauty, also consider texture. Dill and fennel are both famous for having this kind of feathery, delicate, airy, ethereal type of texture. The list of vegetables does not include a recommendation for dill, but it does include this particular variety for fennel. And you can see how full and beautiful it looks. And I would just mention that if you wanted to see fennel and how its texture looks growing next to other flowers and vegetables, it is almost always included in the herb garden at Cornell Botanic Gardens and also in the Pounder vegetable garden at Cornell Botanic Gardens. So for those of you who are in or near Ithaca, you can visit and see that particular plant in action. Also, consider stems and foliage for their beauty. Kale almost always has those ruffled and crinkly leaves, and this dwarf blue variety is very ruffled as well as having a very pretty color. And then Swiss chard bright lights, I think, is a pretty popular variety of Swiss chard. That picture does not lie at all. The stems are always have those beautiful magentas and yellows and oranges. And I am often tempted to harvest some Swiss chard and just bring it in the house and put it in a glass vase to have sitting around just for its beauty. So it'll definitely add a lot of color to your vegetable garden. So those are a few vegetable varieties that you could consider adding to your garden for color. Now, the way I came up with those was just to consult that list of vegetable varieties for New York State and then research them more thoroughly by reading about them, looking at pictures, to find the ones that I felt had really nice ornamental qualities. And you can do that too. So we'll pause here again to see if there are any questions about selecting vegetables for ornamental qualities.
Let's see. Not a ton of questions right now. Jenny and I have been answering all sorts of stuff, but a couple of really great comments. So for instance, Sarah chimes up that hummingbirds love scarlet runners. So aside from making your garden beautiful in terms of like the flowers that you're growing, you're also creating a habitat for all these other creatures in our world. So if you want to invite things like hummingbirds into your garden, then yeah, things like scarlet runners are great ideas. We have a question. When do you harvest Swiss chard and kale?
Well, I harvest mine. I start harvesting kale as soon as the small leaves look edible, because I like putting the baby leaves in salads. And just for me, my Swiss chard is always producing early, and I always kind of ignore it because I'm busy eating other things. And then I really go after harvesting it toward later in the summer, but that's just personal choice on my part.
Yeah, the nice thing about a lot of your greens, all your leafy things, is they're pretty forgiving, and you can pretty much harvest them anytime from the time they're just barely big enough to eat. So you know, when I put in my lettuces or my kales, any of my greens that are you know, where I want to eat the leaves, when I go to thin my plants, I'll snip off whatever thinnings I have, and then I have microgreens for a salad. So you can start eating them when they're really tiny. You know, kale from the time they're basically sprouts through microgreens, and you can eat them when the leaves are huge, or you can let your kale just sit there and get bigger and bigger and bigger, and you harvest it, you know, in November after that first frost when it gets really sweet. So greens are really forgiving. The only exception to that is if you have deer. The second question after the Swiss chard and kale question is, what veggies are deer resistant? Deer really love greens, but they don't love alliums, and you noted that. So for anybody else who doesn't know what alliums are anything in like the onion garlic family. So onions and shallots and garlic, those are great things to have in your garden, and deer will stay away from them. And what I'll often do is I'll plant a whole bunch of these things that deer hate. those really smelly plants, the calendulas, the marigolds, a lot of my alliums, and then somewhere nestled in this big mass of things that the deer hate, I might plant something that the deer actually kind of like. They're never going to get near it because they have to get past this wall of these, you know, the marigolds and onions to get to that thing. But there are other veggies that the deer don't really love. Jenny, you had a really good list of those.
I did, and I can send that with the resources when we do the follow-up email.
But mostly it's alliums, anything that's really like any herbs that are really strong smelling, the deer will stay away from. But a lot of nightshades the deer don't like.
Yeah.
So potatoes, tomatoes, they'll sometimes nibble the edges of my pepper plant, but then they'll ignore it after that. Eggplant, again, another nightshade they don't really love so much. My very first sprouts that came up, my very first things that came up in my seed starting were my cardoon plants. So cardoon is related to artichoke. Artichokes and cardoons, the deer stay away from those because they're really spiky and this like big architectural spiky looking plants. So basically imagine if you tried to munch on it, if it would hurt you or be too smelly, you're not going to eat it if you're a deer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There's also a question, which I'll just briefly answer, about why you would choose a raised bed. What are the advantages of a raised bed over just a traditional garden bed? I'm just going to be really brief on that since that's not the focus of this class. But the short answer would be if you have soil that is not ideal in your garden, so either contaminated, if you live in an urban area, a lot of us have contaminated soil, or really poor drainage, or in, like Mila lives in a place where it's really shallow depth to bedrock. So anytime you have an issue with your soil, the easiest way to solve that problem is to build up and bring new soil in. And so that is a great reason to use a raised bed. And I'm imagining that this person is thinking specifically of a constructed wood raised beds. There's also other things we call raised bed, which is really anytime we elevate the soil, that's called a raised bed. Another thing is if you have really young kids, sometimes having a raised bed keeps the young kids out of your garden. So those would be the beginnings, and we could teach a whole class on that one, but that's sort of the beginning for there.
And just so you know, there's a whole bunch of questions here that are actually really very specific to a particular gardener situation. So we're going to hold those questions till the end, and then we're going to if we have time, we'll go through those. If not, we can direct you to our Grow line, and this is a really great resource for all of you to jot down right now. I know we said we would send you all sorts of things, but this is one we will send you, but always write it down because it's a great thing to have. It's we have a whole crew of master gardeners who are staffing what we call our Grow line. So they are doing the regular Grow line shifts. They're usually available Monday through Friday from about 9:30 to about 3:30 in the afternoon. And they will answer your emails about any of your specific garden questions. And you can reach them at growline1@gmail.com.
I just might add to that too, if you are in a county outside of Tompkins, you will have your own hotline in your county. So you can go to your CCE webpage for your county and just go to the gardening page. And almost every county, not all of them, but almost every county has a Grow line or a garden hotline. And then also if you're outside of the state, look to your own cooperative extension. And then if you're in Tompkins County, then email the Grow line at growline1@gmail.com.
Okay,
All right.
I am going to mention one last point before we move on is Pat is here. Pat used to be the manager of our hort department, and she's just a great source of information. She's mentioning within the chat about a bunch of container varieties. So as Teresa's talk goes on, she's going to talk about using containers in your garden as well. So don't forget that some of these things, when they're growing and fruiting, they're beautiful. These vegetables can be gorgeous as container plants. And Pat has a few in the chat that are lists of specific varieties that do well that way. So with that, we're going to go ahead and move on.
All right. Thank you again for the questions and the wonderful answers from Jenny and Mila. So we have been focused up until now on plants, either annuals for your garden or vegetable varieties that are ornamental in nature. And now we're going to switch gears just a little bit and talk about the importance of how you arrange your beds, edging your beds, that kind of thing. So this person, Jennifer Bartley, wrote an article titled, "Who Says a Kitchen Garden Can't Be Beautiful?" And she said that colorful flowering plants, attractive enclosures, and crisp edges are just a few of the details that can transform an ordinary kitchen garden into a masterpiece. So we were just talking about raised beds, and if you have raised beds, you already have edges. So the picture on the left shows somebody bought a bunch of troughs to use for their raised beds, and the walls of those troughs very definitely create a defined edge. And the picture on the right shows what might be a more commonly seen type of raised bed, which is just some sort of lumber or wood used to create a frame around your vegetable beds. But what if you don't have raised beds? Maybe it's a prohibitive expense, or there's some other reason why you don't want to use them. Well, you can still create edges, and edges are still important. But how do you go about creating them? Well, use some of the vegetables and herbs that you're probably going to be growing anyway to plant an outline, around your beds. And some that you can consider using in this way would be come and cut again lettuces, early baby greens, curly parsley, a marching line of bunching onions. You may also call these scallions. They take up a very small amount of space, and since I have such a small garden, that's what I'm going to try to do for edging this year. Mila suggested Finissimo basil. The picture on the lower right is Finissimo basil. You can see it's a very fine-leaved basil. It grows in a mounding shape. So if you have the space for a plant this big to use as edging, go for it. That would be beautiful. And then there are short varieties of thyme and chives that you can find out there, and these could also be used as edging. And then go back and think about some of the flowers that we already discussed. We talked about sweet alyssum being a pretty small, compact annual. You could definitely use that for edging. You could use the smaller varieties of marigolds, and even early in the season, you could use violas and pansies. So just because you don't have a raised bed is no excuse for not having edges. And you can even use mulch to create the impression of an edge. And you can see in this picture, I think it's actually the pathways that are mulched. But you can see that the contrast between the bed and the mulch and the pathways creates this sense of an edge, and which is very useful. So why are these edges so important anyway when we are trying to create a beautiful vegetable garden? And it's just that our eyes crave a sense of organization, and very often when we're out in nature, we're looking for a sense of containment that says, yes, there's a human being in charge of this space. And so putting in a little effort to create these edges gives us that sense of organization and human-tended space that we're going for. Any questions about edges?
Oh, there we go. I'm doing it the wrong way. We have some questions about the things that you had in your picture. So in the chat, we had a question about the metal basins that you showed, about them getting too hot. And I want to say that is not a problem at all for us who live in the Northeast, where we always crave more heat for our garden. So things in those metal containers will warm up earlier, so the soil will warm earlier. You might be able to get things going a little faster in there. And there are certain kinds of plants that absolutely love the heat. And in fact, if you want to ever get something like a good cantaloupe up here in the Northeast, growing things where there's a heat sink is actually a huge advantage. So that's one of the reasons you might want to use metal bins. Of course, they do get hot, so things like your lettuces are not going to survive well in there unless they're kind of an early season crop that you're trying to get going faster, and then you're going to replace that later on. Other questions that we have about edges, we have questions about using pressure treated wood for garden beds, and no, we do not recommend using pressure treated wood if you're going to be building a garden bed or for edibles. For ornamentals is a different story, but there are definitely issues with using pressure treated wood next to what you're eating. We can get, cedar is a good choice for a lot of these. Hemlock is something that's really easily kind of available around here. And also locust, black locust is something that we have readily available here in our Ithaca area and in the Northeast in general. And that is really rot resistant, so you could use that. Someone answered in the chat. Their rough cut pine will last for 3 to 5 years. So if you only need your garden bed for a few years, then that's okay. There's some question about more of that locust number, and one of our guests added the number for the locust lumber company that's local.
Thank you for that.
Anything else?
Are we ready to move on?
I think so.
Yeah.
All right. You guys are asking great questions. So, of course, even before you think about your edges, if you don't already have a garden that is laid out in a particular way, you need to think about what the layout of your garden is and what kind of shapes your beds are going to take within the garden. Ellen Ecker Ogden says that the 4-square design is one of the most practical designs and is a building block for many other garden designs. So we'll take a look at that. Here's an example of a garden that uses the 4-square design. You can see that basically it's a square with paths in a T shape. This particular garden design is adaptable to both large and small gardens. You could imagine making each one of those squares bigger and the paths bigger, or you could imagine repeating that 4-square over and over again so you have as many beds as you need. It allows for planting patterns within the squares, which will increase the beauty and interest in your garden. And you can see in the forefront there, the square in the forefront, there's kind of a checkerboard planting pattern going on in there. And this 4-square layout is also variable. For example, if you spread those squares out a little bit, you'd have space in the middle to put an octagon or maybe a circular bed, which would give this a different look and a spot for a focal point right in the middle of the garden. Or you could chop off the interior piece of each one of those squares, making them a little bit more triangular in nature, and create space for that circular type of bed in the middle. So you can do a lot with just starting with something simple like a 4-square. But there are other shapes to consider when designing your layout. And of course, the shape you choose is going to do a lot to give the garden the kind of character you're looking for. So there are L-shaped beds and cross-shaped beds. In this picture, they are using them together with the cross shape in the middle, and then the L shapes kind of tucked into the spaces around the cross. Obviously, you can choose to have rectangular beds, triangles, spirals, wagon wheels, arches, just about any kind of shape you can think of, you could use for a garden bed. Here are examples of rectangles and triangles. The garden on the left is meticulously laid out with primarily rectangles around the outside, except on the corners where they're trying to accommodate the entrance to a pathway. It has a very, very organized appearance. The garden on the right looks more rustic and casual, but still the triangles say, somebody has been here working on this garden and, cares about making it look interesting, and has put some shapes together that work together and point toward that small focal point, the little tree in the container there. Here's an example of a forest square with L's. So in this case, the gardener has chosen to take away the inner corners of those 4 squares. So they've ended up with a more triangular shaped beds. And so there's room in the middle for the beautiful circle or octagon, whatever it is, that makes a focal point for the garden. And then around the forest square, there are these large L's at work. You may be interested in including spirals in your vegetable garden. You can make flat spirals right in your raised beds or in your soil. And I'll show you a picture toward the end of the class where the gardener has done that. These spirals, you can see from some of the photographs that they are built so that they have kind of a ramp effect, and that the garden rises as it curls around and goes toward the middle. This allows for good drainage, and these kinds of spirals are often used for herbs, some of which need really good drainage. And what you would do if you chose to build this kind of spiral is put the ones that need the driest soil and the most sun right at the top. I think this would make a really nice focal point in a garden, or you could build one elsewhere in your landscape. Any questions about shapes that we might want to build for our gardens?
No specific questions, but lots of great comments about how the symmetry is so pleasing and how beautiful those gardens look.
They certainly are.
It just goes to show that when you add a little bit of geometry to your garden, suddenly you've upped your garden game to this other level. And it might be a matter of, well, instead of building a rectangular garden bed, I'm going to choose a triangular shape, and suddenly it feels a little bit more intentional and maybe a little different than what you're expecting.
Very good comment. I'm going to move on then. Once you have your beds, the next thing to consider is planting in patterns. And Anne-Marie Hendry, who wrote an article, How to Design a Potager Garden, says possibilities for patterns within a garden are just about limitless. And I'll show you some examples of what we mean by planting in patterns. So I think we've all planted in rows. That's one of the first things that comes to mind when we think about planting our vegetable gardens. But we don't have to necessarily plant in a straight row. In the photograph on the right, the gardener has chosen to make curvy rows. And those curvy rows are beautiful in and of themselves, but they've been accentuated by the fact that the gardener has chosen to alternate colors from row to row. and alternate texture from row to row. So these curvy rows really, really stand out and make a statement. And then in the rows within the raised beds, the picture on the bottom left, very different from the curvy rows, but some of the same things are going on here. The raised bed that is in the foreground, notice that there's a row of onions or some sort of allium that is right down the middle and separates the lettuce that is in the close foreground, and I'm not quite sure what's on the other side of that bed, something else that's kind of moundy. And so again, alternating what is in the rows has created a juxtaposition that's very pleasing. So if you do something like that with your rows, that's very beautiful. Another idea with rows is to continue your row around the corner. Now this gardener looks like he had a kind of a terraced infrastructure to start with, and so the gardener chose to just keep that shape going. The stone wall goes around the corner, and so these rows of vegetables, and looks like there's some flowers in there too, are also going around the corner. This gardener is really taking advantage of the infrastructure, the shape of the infrastructure he has to work with, and has created a strong sense of repetition, which is another important element to bring in to beautify your garden. Repetition is important in ornamental gardens, and you can see that it can be used in vegetable gardens as well. We've looked at this picture before, but this time I want to look at it not only for the 4-square design that we talked about before, but for the planting patterns within these squares. Now, you can see that there are a couple of the squares where the gardener has chosen to plant in a diagonal pattern. The square all the way to the right, it appears that the gardener planted in sort of an X shape with those sort of dusty green plants, and then filled in the X's with some of the same plants, in some cases, and different ones in other of the triangles. And then there's the checkerboard appearance that we've seen before. So if you think about, using your plants and planting them in creative patterns, is going to add a lot of interest to your vegetable garden. You can also do a circle. The circular pattern in this particular bed stands out because not only are the plants planted in a circular way, but once again, the gardener has chosen contrasting colors in order to make the circle pattern stand out. And we've seen this before, making the rows stand out. In this case, we're making the circle pattern stand out. And just because your bed is a square like it is in this particular picture doesn't mean you can't plant in a circle. Of course you can. Also, the gardener here has elected to put a little focal point in the middle of this circle. It looks like Swiss chard, which is picking up the colors of both the red and green lettuces that are in the rest of the bed. Another example of repetition, which is one of the things we're striving for. Zigzags are another planting pattern. You may also call them staggered rows. You can see in the bed in the foreground that this kind of zigzag pattern can create a very pleasing visual effect, and it could also increase your yield. You do this by making a standard row wider and then planting in a W formation. And like in so many of the other planting patterns we looked at, if you plant in using contrast, whether color or texture, that's going to do a lot to make your planting pattern stand out and enhance it. And we're going to pause here for questions about planting patterns.
We do have a couple of questions, and some of it has to do with the practicalities of doing this. So I think just like in anything in life, if you want the most pragmatic way to do something, it's not always the most aesthetically pleasing way to do it. So, you know, that's one of the reasons our farmers grow things in crop rows, because they need their rows to fit a tractor, or they need to be able to use a specific tool to weed in a certain area. So, so yeah, sometimes some of these might be a little less pragmatic than doing those straight rows. Somebody asked, oh, well, the really gorgeous picture of those curved rows with all those greens packed in together. They said, well, how does someone walk and harvest that?
Very carefully.
Very, very carefully is the thing. So that means that you're not going to harvest quickly. You're going to move slowly through that space. You're going to pick your way through. So it is not the most efficient thing to do, but sometimes we chose pretty things over efficient things. When it comes to things like these beds, oh, go back one to where you had the checkerboard. There's a talk about how it's not too ergonomic if these beds are too wide. So in this case, you know, the general recommendation is you want to be able to reach all the way into your garden bed. So you want your garden bed to be comfortable enough that you can stand at the edge and you can reach to the other side. And then if you go around to the other side of that garden bed, you can reach in. So imagine if there were two of you, and you could go like this and touch hands in the middle. That's about as big as you want your garden bed to be, because bigger than that, you're going to have to basically step into your bed to take care of things. And it's a never good idea. You never want to be able to step into a garden bed and compress that soil. So think about the ergonomics that you have in combination with these tips for making it pretty. So in this case, those are really wide garden beds, but there's a pathway all the way around. So somebody can reach in a few feet to reach every single spot in that pathway, from that pathway. And then let's see. We have a question with repetition, do you sometimes have to forgo crop rotation? And I'm going to say that it's not necessarily mutually exclusive, because a lot of times we rotate crops by season. So just choose one set of things this year and then a different set of things next year to do that.
And I'll talk about repetition a little bit more, so maybe it'll become a little clearer what we're doing with that.
And then one final question, since we see so many in this last section, so many different kind of garden paths in between, a couple of ideas for garden path materials. And I would say use what you've got is my first answer. A lot of people love having just a grass mown path, and they'll make their path basically as wide as their lawnmower. And that's, you know, so one pass with a lawnmower takes care of that path. Other people prefer to have something that does not grow in their pathway. So, you know, a pebble or a stone material is a great way to kind of permanently make sure that nothing's growing there. It's a little more expensive and heavy to build. On the plus side, it tends to warm up faster, so you'll actually have a warmer garden area with that. Mulch is always a fine material for your pathway, but I'd say think about, if you're really thinking about designing your pathway, think about how much time you have to maintain that pathway, and how many resources you have at your disposal to make that pathway.
I'll maybe add one thing to that, Mila, is I always encourage folks when they're designing pathways, try not to do things that can't be undone. So I tend to steer away from gravel because it's really hard to remove gravel. Whereas if you have, for example, large pieces of flagstone with little bits of gravel around them, even though they're heavy to move, once you've removed flagstone, what's underneath is soil. And that just helps if you ever need to do a massive redesign, that your pathways are, you know, they are movable. But once you start to add very small bits of rocks, you're kind of stuck with what you've got, and you've added something to the soil that now maybe wasn't once there. And so I really prefer to stick with things that either are going to decompose or could be picked up and moved in the long run.
And it depends on what you want to commit to as well. Like
Yeah.
if you know that you're committing to this garden design, go ahead and do the heavier duty thing that's going to be harder to undo. But if you're not quite sure, if you're kind of testing out a few things, then go ahead and do a grassy path or do a mulch path, because both of those are really easy to change in future years.
Mm-hmm.
Someone says they just put cardboard down and cover it with straw. That's a perfectly fine way to have a pathway. The only thing about cardboard and straw is it can be really slippery. So I'd be a little bit cautious about that if you're worried about your footing. The other thing too is that every once in a while, if you have a pathway that has natural material, cardboard, straw, mulch, that stuff is going to compress down, it's going to break up, and you're going to end up actually having some really nice soil in your pathways. And what I found is that after a few years, by adding mulch, I've kind of lifted my pathway up a little bit, and then that's brought it down and become this really kind of nice dark kind of black humus rather. And so what I'll do is every few years I'll go through and I'll take my shovel and I'll scrape that stuff up and put it into my garden beds and lower that pathway by, you know, a few inches. And what that does is it lowers the pathway. You scrape off that top layer so that all that kind of rich stuff that's been kind of breaking down over years can get put into your garden bed. It raises your garden bed up a little bit higher and lowers your path level back down to a less fertile layer of soil. And then I start over again.
And I will just add that because my vegetable garden is pretty small and I do try to rotate, bits and pieces of my paths come and go so that I can rotate and change the shape and sizes of my beds as needed. So that's just another plug for perhaps keeping your pathways something that you can fairly easily change if you need to.
Mm-hmm. And then we have one last question that's really pertinent to planting these patterns. Someone says, well, what happens when you just want to harvest a few heads of lettuce? It completely wrecks your pattern? And it's true, it does change your pattern, but that's a great opportunity to do succession planting, meaning that you've planted one and then you've planted the next thing so that the next thing starts growing as soon as you've harvested the one. And you can do things like, you know, well, I'm only going to harvest every other red lettuce today, and so your pattern still has some sort of cohesion to it even though you're continually harvesting. And I think we can move on to the next section.
All right, here we go. So next we're going to talk about the importance of boundaries and borders and what they contribute to the aesthetic qualities of your garden. Ellen Ogden says that enclosing the perimeter of your kitchen garden with a low stone wall, a boxwood hedge, some espaliered fruit trees, or a rustic split rail fence will do more than simply keep out the deer. It creates a distinctive border as well as a transition between where the lawn ends and the garden begins. So that's a mouthful, so let's break this down just a little bit. I want to make sure that we're clear about what we mean by boundaries and borders and how these are different from the edges we've talked about so far. So in this very simple diagram, the green rectangle represents the inside of your garden, and the dark rectangles on the green rectangle are your garden beds. The white lines around those dark rectangles are the edges that we've already talked about. And now we're using the terms boundaries and borders to mean something else. The boundary, the black line that goes around the green rectangle or the garden, is something like a fence or a stone wall, some kind of enclosure that encloses your entire garden. A border is the transition area between the garden and what most of us have, which would be some sort of a lawn. So edges we've already talked about, and now we're going to talk about boundaries and borders. So here's a simple example of that diagram in action. This happens to be the back of my house. that is a picture of my small vegetable garden. The boundary is this very utilitarian fence that also happens to function as a barrier because I share my landscape with a lot of deer and other creatures. And then the border is the area outside the fence, which is where I plant all those herbs and onions and flowers. Some of the flowers that we were talking about with annuals, some of those smelly herbs that Mila was mentioning that deer tend to avoid, and some of those fragrant, heavily scented flowers like marigolds. I can successfully grow them outside my boundary or barrier, and so I do. So this is just a quick example of a boundary, the fence, and the border, the part outside the fence. So boundaries can be part of your design style. If you like the cottagey look, for example, maybe you want to use a picket fence for your boundary. If you're more of a rustic person, maybe you want something like a split rail fence. Maybe you just have to use something that's very functional in nature, like I have to do because of needing to keep creatures away. You may also want a boundary to provide privacy. Some people live very close to their neighbors and might appreciate the privacy that a boundary would afford you. Or some people have their vegetable gardens in their front yards because that's where the sun is, and maybe a little privacy will help keep itchy hands from helping themselves to your produce. Whatever you choose for building your boundary, you can create it from a variety of materials. There are fencing of different kinds. There are walls that could be made of stone or brick. There are shrub boundaries, and there are floral boundaries. So let's look at a couple of examples of these. Here's a couple really pretty fence boundaries. The one on the right has kind of an open arrangement on top and a little more closed at the bottom. What I really like is that the gardener has elected to include a gravel border. It looks like it goes around the entire garden and is used for the pathways as well. And so that's creating a nice transition from the garden to the lawn. I also like the fence on the left. I like the combination of the smooth, somewhat refined lumber, and then the uprights, which are these rustic branches that have been cut to size. I think that's a really nice looking and creative fence. However, the gardener has not included a border, and so that kind of jolts my eye. I feel like the transition from the vegetable garden to the lawn is just too abrupt. These are fence boundaries that a lot of you may have, something very utilitarian like this, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with it. Mine is, as you saw, was very utilitarian in nature. And both of these gardens are set in a very beautiful landscape. But once again, the garden does not feel connected to the rest of the landscape because there's no border that says I'm reaching out and I'm transitioning to all of the other plants that are around me in this broader area. Here's another example of a fence boundary. I think the gardener in this home must have spent hours and hours finding all of these branches, binding them together, creating that arbor. And I think it's very charming and a very different kind of fence boundary than what you usually see. And I also like that the gardener has continued the theme by using slightly larger and thicker branches as the edge around his or her raised beds. I feel like they could use some material on their pathways. It looks like a bit of a mud pit, but I'm sure they'll get to that. Now, if you live in a palace, you might have a walled boundary, something like this brick boundary, or maybe the stone wall. Most of us do not have a boundary like this. We may have at most something like a low stacked stone wall, but this would certainly work if you had access to a boundary like this. You may be interested in creating a shrub boundary, and boxwood is something that is often used for a shrub boundary. You can plant the boxwood shrubs fairly close together and then trim and prune them into a hedge shape. And this might work just fine for you if you're not needing to keep creatures out, or you could use this along with a more transparent kind of fencing. And then floral boundaries are something that you can consider as well. The purple flower in this picture is lavender. I think it looks absolutely stunning in this setting. And certainly something that I think you would appreciate, especially if you're an ornamental gardener as well as a vegetable gardener. I've also read a recommendation that you could try peonies in a similar way, and I think that's a good idea because after peonies flower, the foliage stays nice for a really long time. So it would create, you know, kind of almost like a shrubby effect for the rest of the summer. So we've looked at examples of boundaries. Let's just take one slide to focus on borders a little bit more. The photograph on the right shows both a boundary and a border. The picket fence is the boundary around the vegetable garden. And then the gardener has created a border that's just full of plants. And then you can see that it transitions into the rest of the lawn. And then the picture on the lower left is pretty interesting. I think the gardener was pretty clever in this case, taking advantage of a border that was already there, which is the walkway. And this gardener has not necessarily used a boundary. There's no fence there. There's a little line of stones that you might be able to see. But they really leveraged a border that was existing, and it creates the transition from that vegetable and flower garden to the lawn. And I think you can see that it creates a more complete feel if you have the border between your garden and the lawn, and you don't just begin the lawn at the edge of your garden. All right, do we have any questions about boundaries and borders?
There's been a little conversation going on in the chat about deer fencing, and everyone's sort of chiming in with what's worked for them. I'll just say that the sort of quote unquote sure thing I would say is 8 feet. Some people have said in height for a fence. Some people have had some luck with 6 feet or 7 feet. But I think some of us have definitely seen deer jump a 6-foot fence. There's also a way to do 2 fences that give a depth. I can't even remember what that fence is called. I don't know if you remember. I think it's called a 3D fence, where if you're doing a shorter fence for some reason that you need to, that you actually have essentially a second fence that tricks the eye of the deer and they can't judge whether they can jump over it. Anyway, it's called a 3D fence, and but an 8-foot fence is pretty standard. And especially with if you have a pretty small garden, then sometimes you can go a little shorter because of that sort of visual challenge they have with the depth perception. But if you're fencing in a really large space, you really need 8 feet.
It also depends on topography And we have a lot of topography around here. So if you're in a really flat area, then you definitely want an 8-foot fence. But if you've got, if you've got a bit of a slope and then you've got your fence, that fence could be maybe even 6 feet tall, because that deer will have to kind of go up that rise to get over that. Or if you're close to other things where the deer can't kind of, get a running start to get over that fence, if there's a really short space between, say, like, where your car's parked and where that fence might be, you might be able to get away with a shorter fence, but really an 8-foot fence is kind of the standard if you're thinking about kind of like a flat area with enough space for that deer to kind of run and jump.
Okay, and I'm going to continue on since I realize time is wasting here.
Yep, we're at about 7:35, 7:40.
Okay, so the next topic is about potager gardens. A potager is simply a vegetable plot that follows the principles of garden design to create an area which is not only ornamental but productive too, according to Anne-Marie Hendry. For other people who may always forget how to pronounce the term, it is potager. And so what do we mean? Let's talk a little bit more about what we mean. As the quote said, we're bringing the concepts of ornamental garden design into the vegetable garden. And some of those key concepts are rhythm, which you create through repetition, which we've mentioned on the fly a little bit earlier. Color, texture, juxtaposition, which we've also talked about already. Lines, which in the case of a vegetable garden is going to be your paths, which should lead your eye to a focal point. The focal point itself, and then the edges and boundaries and borders that we've talked about already. So let's dig into each one of these ideas a little bit. Rhythm is something that that helps draw your eye around a garden, and you can create it by repeating a planting pattern, for example. So in the picture on the left, you can see that the gardener has created very wide rows, and that row in the middle has a very striking and predictable planting pattern. The vegetables are planted in very definite blocks of green, red, and that predictable planting pattern, very quickly your eye picks up on the fact that it's going to be repeated over and over again, and that creates rhythm. And then the picture on the right, the yellow color is repeated several times. There are calendula or some kind of marigold maybe in the foreground. You see it again in the background. You see it again in the yellow squash that's growing. And it's much more of a hit or miss effect, but still the color is repeated, and that repetition of color is what is giving you a sense of rhythm and pulling your eye. Color is very important in an ornamental garden, and you can take advantage of color themes and use those within your vegetable garden. So for example, if you're partial to a particular color, maybe you want to focus on that color in your vegetable garden. The picture on the left shows a gardener who has decided that she is going to use orange flowers in her vegetable garden, and only orange flowers, at least the part we can see. And this decision would be called a monochromatic color theme. It's interesting though, because even though she's focusing on orange flowers, she's getting the repetition of color but using different plants. It looks to me like there are marigolds in the foreground and nasturtiums a couple of rows over. So even though it's a monochromatic color scheme, the different plants keep it interesting. You might decide you want something that is more soothing and calm in nature, in which case an analogous color scheme might be of interest to you. The photograph in the middle shows that the gardener has selected plants with tones of greens and almost blues. And these are very close to each other on the color wheel. You can see in the corner there. And so this is going to give you a more subtle, calming sense in your garden. And then finally, there's the complementary color scheme. The lettuces in the right-hand picture, they're those famous green and red lettuces again. And those colors are opposite each other on the color wheel. So it's going to create a very energetic and contrasting type of effect. So there's a lot you can do with color, but if you just consider these three kind of approaches and play with them, see what you like in your garden. Juxtaposition or contrast is something that is important. Here's that picture of the curvy rows again. We talked about how the contrast was created between those rows with both color and texture. And then the other picture on the left, there's juxtaposition with, in each row in the foreground, there's something different. There's contrast in color, there's contrast in height, there's contrast in leaf size and shape. So they've introduced a lot of juxtaposition just in those small beds in the front. At the same time, there's repetition because you can see there's a little pathway cutting that bed that almost looks like a triangular bed in half, but the same plants are on either side of that pathway, which is nice repetition. Lines are important, or pathways, in a potager garden, and these lines or paths should lead your eye directly to your focal point, which each of these gardens successfully do. The one on the left goes to a fairly elaborate focal point with benches and a circle and a pillar and a huge urn with plants spilling over. In the photograph on the right, a much simpler garden, it's just a container with a plant in the middle. But both of those accomplish the goal of pathways that lead your eye to a focal point. And here's an example of a garden. It has those grassy pathways that Mila was mentioning. It has triangular beds, which are one of the options we talked about earlier. And all of those pathways lead your eye directly to that circular focal point in the middle. And so this works really well too in terms of fulfilling some of the design elements of a potager garden. So there's a lot to be pleased about with this garden, not only the paths and the focal points, but the planting patterns that are here. You can see a shrub boundary in the background, etc. Okay, any questions about picking up pointers from potager gardens?
Let's see. We have lots of people saying really gorgeous things about how they appreciate that a lot of these gardens that they're seeing are on a slightly smaller scale. So some of these are, 4 foot by 4 foot-ish beds. And it just goes to show that you don't necessarily need to have this gigantic estate to be able to do something really beautiful. You can start on a small side. Without, so someone said, so nice to see these methods on a scale we can try without grand efforts or lots of land. Someone wanted to know if any of these pictures were taken from around here and if we can ever have a tour of these places. And there are a handful of gardens in the Ithaca area that really look that good. Unfortunately, this may not be a year for touring gardens. We don't know yet. Hopefully by summertime, we can start to tour again.
And I will mention when we get to the end of the slides, some gardens you can visit for inspiration if you happen to be around here.
Awesome.
All right, moving on. The next thing.
And actually, Teresa, sorry, somebody asked if there's a class for container gardening.
Oh,
and
I'm typing the answer to that right now.
Okay, great. And there is, and Mila's going to put the data in. We're actually going to have 2 classes likely on container gardening. So we have one that's going to be taught by Martha Giamusas, who's just absolutely wonderful horticulturalist. She leads the beautification brigade, so all the beautiful planters you see on the commons and all throughout Tompkins County. So she's going to be giving you her secrets on how to make beautiful floral container gardens, and also integrating edibles into those. And then also we're still dreaming up the rest of our COVID programming, but I think a vegetable gardening in containers class is in the near future, possibly even in the next couple weeks. So we're still working on planning that for you.
That, and there's been a lot of chatter about large animals in the garden, deer, chipmunks, woodchuck. So I'm thinking of those large, because usually we think of like the little bugs that come in and what to do about them. But there's a lot of chatter about what to do about these kind of larger animals that come into our garden. So I think it might be a good thing to have a how to garden with critters class coming up soon.
Mm-hmm.
Sounds like great classes, and I'll be there as a student.
I was going to say, maybe you're teaching one, Teresa.
No, not on those topics, but it sounds like something I'd love to attend.
Fantastic.
All right, so let's keep moving. You are going to want to build or buy functional and artistic structures to include in your beautiful vegetable garden. Ellen Ogden says height is remarkably effective in creating drama in your kitchen garden design. And of course, you're going to absolutely need structures for a functional purpose. You need them for tomatoes, and very often those commercial metal cages are just not sufficient for indeterminate tomatoes. You need them for pole beans and peas. And if you are trying to save space like so many of us, you might need them for cucumbers and squash, and maybe even for a climbing flower that serves as a focal point. So some common types of structures that we will often see and we often find useful in our vegetable gardens include teepees. They can be tall or short depending on what you're using them for. You need at least 3 poles. Many times more are used. And for a rustic look, you can use branches that you may already have, right in your landscape somewhere. Instead of discarding them, reuse them for something like this teepee. Very often all it takes is binding the branches together at the top and then winding thin rope or twine around the poles, and so that the peas and beans have something to climb on. There are creative looking teepees. The one on the left, it looks like instead of the twine, they've used a grapevine to wrap around the poles. And the one on the right, somebody used some old garden implements and bound them together to make a teepee for those nasturtiums. I actually think there's a cage inside that teepee as well. Arches and arbors are often decorative as well as functional. I like the way the pathway leads you right down the middle of this particular arch in this picture. They're very suitable for things like pole beans, melons, pumpkins, squash, peas, and cucumbers. It looks like we have squash growing on this particular example. And I wanted to include this picture of the Pounder Garden Arch. Again, this is for those of you who are fairly local to the Ithaca area and have access to Cornell Botanic Gardens. There's a vegetable garden there called the Pounder Garden, and it has this very extensive arch right in the middle of the garden that serves as a focal point and a very strong climbing structure for beans and squash. And it's actually big enough that it even provides shade in the summer. And it's made out of very simple list of materials: welded wire cattle fencing that comes from a big box store. It comes flat, and then you bend it into an arch shape. And then they attach that fencing to some lumber with U-nails, and then put a few stakes in the ground to help the whole bent structure keep its shape. And you can very easily visit this garden and examine the construction and easily build one yourself. I've put these red lines on here because I took this picture in the winter And I wanted you to get a sense of the depth of this thing. This is actually 3 lengths of cattle fencing that have been lined up side by side to create a longer archway. And it's absolutely beautiful when it's covered with something like squash or gourds that tend to hang through those openings in the fencing and make a little decorative overhead planting pattern, instead of the planting pattern being underneath you. So tent trellises are very popular for cucumbers and beans. The one on the left is an example of a tent trellis that you can see at the Ithaca Children's Garden. The others are just additional examples. Sometimes people use netting that they lay over the tent structure for the plants to crawl up. And sometimes you could lay something like thin bamboo against the horizontal tent piece that goes across the top, and then bind those to the horizontal piece of the structure. Cages and obelisks are important. Cages for tomatoes. I'm really envious of those particular tomato cages. They look beautiful as well as very strong. You could have an obelisk like this as a climbing structure, and also if you choose to paint it like this gardener did, another way to introduce color into your garden. Here's more examples of color. The picture on the right was taken at the Ithaca Children's Garden, and the person who made that yellow teepee had 3 different kinds of stakes. But they decided to paint all of them yellow, which gives them a cohesive appearance, and also picks up all the yellow in the plants growing in this garden. And then you can see another gardener has chosen to use red tomato cages, and yet another picture just showing some stakes that have been painted green and blue. We all have stakes in our gardens, and you can make them more ornamental by painting them. Any questions about structures? And Mila, I do not think I want people to raise their hands because I'm worried about needing to, having problems with my mouse again if we do that.
We'll skip that.
Thank you.
But we had a poll question about if Teresa is so generously thinking about offering a class in the future about structures in the garden. So, one of the questions that we were going to ask everybody here is, would you be interested in attending such a class? So, do you all know how to raise your hand in this? If you go to where it says participants, a little window will pop up that you'll see your name, and you'll see some little options underneath the names, like a green check mark, a red X, and there should be a little hand option that looks like this, and you can use that to raise your hand. And we have lots and lots and lots of raised hands, Teresa. So
yeah, I see the count going up.
Yep.
So that's something that might be a more hands-on class and something that we can consider for the future.
Mm-hmm.
So let's see if I can still advance my slides while we're doing this.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, good. All right. And we'll continue to let people raise their hands, I guess, and I'll continue on. The next thing to consider when you are looking into beautifying your garden is to include accessories. And this slide, we're looking at accessories for creatures. We want to create a home for our bees that may need a place to overwinter their eggs and so on. So the little picture on the left shows a bee hotel made out of a clay pot and some tubular stems. We could include bee hotels of various sorts that would be very appropriate around our gardens. Bird houses are nice accessories. And then we might want to include garden art for some of the human creatures that inhabit our gardens. I have no idea how somebody made this pot structure stick together, but it's kind of amusing and pretty. You can consider including functional accessories. For example, these containers are growing additional vegetables and flowers. A chair or a bench is always very welcome in the garden. We all get tired working out there, or we might just want to sit and admire our garden. So that's an appropriate accessory. And then gates are very functional, but there's no reason why they can't be pretty, like this one with the pretty little sort of sunburst at the top. You can accessorize for tool storage. And I have to thank Jenny for this idea. She said that she gets an old mailbox, paints it, and puts it in her garden and uses it to stash frequently used tools, like maybe your weeding tool and your hand pruners. And so that would be a really cute accessory that has a nice function to it as well. And then after we've done all this work, doing all these things that we've talked about so far today, we certainly want to maintain our gardens by weeding and watering on a very regular basis as needed, by filling in gaps with succession plantings of vegetables or annuals, mulching as needed to suppress weeds and retain moisture, maintaining our boundaries and borders. They might need weeding. Your boundary, might need painting, or maybe if your fence is a little saggy, you need to attend to that. Whatever we do, we all know that the end of the season look will come. That's part of gardening, and by the time that end of season look is upon us, we will probably already be thinking about ideas for things that we want to do and change next year. I think I'm going to keep going since we're running out of time. If that's all right.
That's good.
And I want to talk a little bit about broadening the scope of beyond what we've talked about so far today. Let's spend just a minute on the idea of planting veggies in your ornamental beds. So instead of flowers in your vegetable garden, now we're going to talk about vegetables in your ornamental beds. So in this picture, Swiss chard is paired with sweet alyssum and echinacea. And Swiss chard is something that you can use instead of elephant ears. They both have big leaves, but if you don't have to worry about deer coming along and munching it, you could definitely switch out the Swiss chard for elephant ears. There are a number of short vegetables that you could incorporate in the front of your bed or border that have really nice ornamental qualities. For example, this flashy troutback lettuce has that really nice mottled appearance and a kind of a floral look to it, the way the head is shaped. There's the red new fire lettuce again with the pretty red color. And then you might want to plant a tatsoi, which also has a very pretty floral appearance. And all of these on this slide will take full sun to part shade, and all are on the vegetable varieties for New York State gardeners. I would love to put some of those in front of my ornamental beds, but I can't do that because of the deer. If you're looking for something more of a medium height to include in your ornamental bed, you could consider this neon eggplant. That fruit is just absolutely gorgeous. Really pretty purple color. The bright orange aura pepper, or the yellow bush bean. And I'd appreciate any of these in my ornamental bed because of their colors. So they could go in the middle. And then if you are shopping for something that would be on the taller side, you could include leeks, tomatillos, which would provide both the flowers and the interesting husks around the fruit, and artichokes. Leeks and the tomatillos need full sun. Artichokes will take full sun to part shade. And if you don't like artichokes, you could also consider cardoon, which is another tall vegetable. Some more tall ones that I know Jenny and Mila are partial to are sesame, and you can see from the picture there that it looks similar to foxglove. It almost looks a little bit orchid-like to me as well. And then okra, even if you don't like it, it has a really pretty flower that looks similar to hibiscus. And the one in this picture is called Clemson spineless, which is on our selected list of vegetables that we've referred to so often. So these both need full sun. You get beautiful flowers and pods, and it's something to try in your ornamental bed. And then finally, don't forget rhubarb. It has very large leaves, which are dramatic in the ornamental bed and also provide the function of smothering weeds. Of course, the stems are colorful and edible. There are a number of them on the selected list of vegetable varieties for New York State. The one in this picture happens to be Victoria. And as a bonus, my understanding is that it's a little sweeter than other varieties, so you don't need as much sugar when you process it. And the placement of this just depends on what else you have in the bed. If you've got like a big hedge, and you might want to put the rhubarb in the front of the hedge. If you've got a lot of other smaller things in that bed, then the rhubarb would go in back, of course. And once again, I'm going to move on. We're getting near the end, and I want to show a couple of examples of how we can bring all these ideas together. Here is a really incredible, a view of a really incredible garden that has many of the ideas we've been talking about today. It has a focal point up near the top. You can see a circular focal point of some sort. There's edging not only in the form of what look like raised beds, but also it looks like there is a particular plant that is used over and over again to edge many of these beds. There is a shrub boundary in evidence. There are planting patterns galore. I see circles. There's a large flat spiral. There's staggered rows. This is a really good example of a garden that uses planting patterns to great effect. There's paths, there's a definite layout, and you can see some of the potager ideas expressed very well here. For example, repetition of those edging plants over and over again. In this garden, the emphasis is on focal points. There's one in each bed as well as in the center of the garden. There's very definite edging with the stone around each raised bed. And there's a boundary. There's a large hedge, and there may be a stone wall as well. So I don't see much in the way of color other than yellow. Maybe the gardener was going for a monochromatic color scheme. And I don't see much in the way of planting patterns from this perspective anyway. But that just goes to show that you don't have to incorporate every idea we've talked about today. You incorporate the ones that work for your particular garden and that you're most interested in. In this example, the pretty beanpole blue teepee, it makes a very definite focal point. There's edging, and I like the way that that plain wood frame is grayed out and matches the grayed out picket fence. That's another example of repetition that keeps the eye moving. This does have a boundary, which is the picket fence. The gardener has incorporated flowers. I think I see sweet alyssum and maybe lavender and something yellow, which might be calendula. And there's an accessory. There's a chair there. So this gardener's done a great job of selecting and picking and choosing from some of the ideas we've talked about today. We saw this garden before, but this is a closer look. And this one is a good example of putting the emphasis on integrating flowers and vegetables, putting them together in the same space like what we talked about at the beginning of the evening. There are flowers in this garden, I think both annuals and perennials. There are colorful and textured vegetables. You can see cabbages pretty readily, and it looks like kale. There's a container accessory in the background, and there's no structure, but there is a really prettily shaped tree for height. I don't know about how much shade it casts, but things seem to be growing pretty well here. And then in this particular garden, there's an emphasis on creativity. There's evidence of edging there in the foreground, and there's some very interesting structures. This gardener has made lots of little teepees, and for some reason they each have a little clay hat. I'm not sure about the purpose of the hat, but it's the same kind of teepee over and over again, so they've used a structure to create repetition here. There are paths, there's an abundance of flowers, there are colorful vegetables, and maybe even a little bit of planting pattern going on there in that bed that we see in the foreground. So I hope that you have made note of some ideas that inspire you and that are things that you might like to try in this coming growing season. I know I've thought of some things that I'm going to do in my garden this coming summer. If you need more inspiration, here are some recommendations for you. I've already mentioned the Pounder Vegetable Garden at Cornell Botanic Gardens. It's open at the moment, you just have to maintain social distance. Same for the Robeson York State Herb Garden at Cornell Botanic Gardens. You wouldn't want to visit them now anyway for the most inspiration, because it'll take several months before they are in their full glory. The Ithaca Children's Garden is currently closed, but we hope it will open during the growing season and you can visit it for inspiration. I am now going to stop sharing the slides. And I just want to show you this book, The Complete Kitchen Gardener, which is one that I have been mentioning several times throughout the course of the evening. And this is the one by Ella Ecker Ogden. She's been to Cornell several times to speak, and she has a lot of great ideas in this book. So if she comes again, I would make a point of going to hear her, or if you can't wait, you might want to pick up this book. She's got a lot of ideas for making your vegetable garden beautiful. So good luck, everybody.
Hold that up so it's right in front of your face so we can all see it.
Can you see it now?
A little higher. There you go. Complete kitchen garden. All right. Great.
All right.
All got a good look.
We're going to turn it over for any last questions that we have.
We have a couple of questions in the chat. Pat mentioned that foxgloves or digitalis can be challenging in your garden. They actually produce some toxins that are poisonous. And so, yeah, anyway, it's a nice thing to keep a little separate from some of your veggies. Thanks, Pat, for that. Somebody asked about the sesame, and yes, it is a variety of sesame that can be grown locally. It does produce sesame seeds. I will tell you, I grew it last year, and I did harvest sesame seeds, but I spent a really lot of time working very hard to get a very small handful of sesame seeds. And so in the future, I think I'll just enjoy the flowers and then go to the store and buy some sesame seeds. Call me lazy, but that's how I felt about it. But the flowers are absolutely stunning. And Fruition Seeds is our local seed company that sells those seeds. They're the only people I've seen selling them, and they've worked very hard to breed a sesame variety that really can work here in a northern climate. And other questions? Do you see anything else, Mila? Any other questions we should address?
I think everything else pretty much got addressed in the chat.
Excellent.
Back and forth.
Well, I just want to give the biggest, hugest thank you to you, Teresa. You have been fantastic, absolutely lovely. This is a beautiful slideshow. There is a million thank yous in the chat and compliments to you for what a wonderful job you've done. You'll all be getting an email probably in a few days, if technology agrees with us, with a recording of this presentation. And Teresa's made a wonderful handout for you that has a lot of the details and resources that were in the presentation. Also, we'll be sending around with that email, there's an evaluation. So if you were all in a room with us, we would be guarding the door fiercely until you handed in your evaluation to us. That information is really important for us moving forward in our programming and our reporting. So if you'd be so kind, it's just a very few questions. It takes less than 5 minutes. So that will also come to you in an email. And stay tuned. Mila and I are meeting tomorrow to plan the next month of classes, and we have you all in mind and what you're excited about. So make sure that you are watching our website, our Facebook page, or if you aren't subscribed to our Garden Post newsletter, you can do that on our website also at ccetompkins.org. And we really hope to see you in another class or two, and maybe someday in person soon too. So thank you all for being here, and we wish you well in your gardens.
Thank you, everybody. Happy gardening.
Bye, everybody.
Good night.